The monk's curse. When my mother took my birth details to a monk for fortune-telling, the monk asked, "Why are you bringing the birth details of a dead person?" My mother was furious, but the monk ignored her, suddenly pulling down my pants and staring at me. My mother, thinking he was a pervert, stormed home, grabbed a kitchen knife, and charged at the monk. However, she missed and struck a nearby tree. The monk had already disappeared by the time she turned around. That night, I dreamt of the monk again. His face was pale and his clothes were drenched, with waterweed clinging to him. He kept repeating, "Why are you still alive? You should have died long ago." I woke up screaming, trying to hug my mother, but instead found myself embracing a cold, wet body. I looked up and saw the monk's corpse lying beside me with a twisted smile on his face. My mother rushed in, but when she saw the monk's corpse, she screamed louder than I did. No one could understand why the monk's body appeared in my bed, looking as if it had been dead for a month. My father and some uncles tried to carry the body out, but it wouldn't budge. Even with more help, the body remained immovable. The village chief suggested it was a case of ghost blocking the way, where the soul of a deceased person refuses to leave and sits on their own coffin to prevent it from being taken to the grave. My father, determined to get rid of the body, fetched a knife that my grandfather had used during the war and fiercely struck it against the bed. Miraculously, the body, which had been impossible to lift before, was now easily carried by my father alone. My father's initial plan was to simply wrap the body in a mat and throw it in the woods, but the village chief insisted on a proper burial. My mother agreed, and they arranged for the monk to be buried with due respect. By the time the funeral was over, it was late at night. Just as my mother was about to sleep, there was a loud knock on the door. She opened it slightly, and I saw a pair of wet shoes. My mother spoke briefly to the figure outside and then shut the door. When my father asked who it was, my mother, still groggy, said, "It was Aunt Sarah. She was soaking wet but wouldn't come inside. She just laughed and left." My father shuddered and reminded my mother that Aunt Sarah had drowned in the river earlier that year. Just as my father was about to speak, the knocking resumed, this time with 4 knocks, the exact pattern of a ghost's knock. My father, trying to be brave, shouted towards the door, "Who's out there?" But there was no response, only the continued knocking. My mother, terrified, asked, "Could it be that monk from this morning?" Just as she finished speaking, the window revealed a pale face, muddy and bald. My mother screamed and covered herself with a blanket, holding me tightly. I don't know how much time passed, but when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. Recalling the face from the night before, I called out for my mother, but when I turned to hug her, I found the monk's corpse lying beside me again with that same twisted smile. I blacked out instantly. The double shock was too much, and I developed a high fever that reached 107 degrees. My mother wept as she tried to bring down my temperature with alcohol wipes, cursing the monk all the while. My father came in, covered in mud, and my mother lashed out at him, demanding to know why the monk's body was back in our house. My father, worried, said, "I just went to the cemetery and the grave had been dug up." My mother became even more furious, but what my father said next stunned us all. It wasn't dug up, the body crawled out on its own. A mason confirmed it. The grave opening was smaller at the top, indicating that the body had emerged from within. The atmosphere grew tense, and my parents fell silent. A few minutes later, my father abruptly stood up and swore he would burn the monk's body to ashes. That afternoon, he set the monk's body on fire. Strangely, after that, the nightly knocking stopped, and my fever finally subsided. However, I became somewhat unhinged, muttering nonsense all day, and often pointing at walls as if talking to someone. When my mother asked who I was talking to, I could accurately name people who had died, some of whom I'd never even met. I even knew where their ancestors had hidden their treasures. Following my instructions, my mother dug up a few old silver notes from the ground near our ancestral home. Word spread, and more people came to our house, bringing gifts and leaving either smiling or crying. Our family's financial situation improved significantly, but I don't remember much of what I said or did. I only recall having a long, strange dream where I was in a vast white world with people walking by me, each accompanied by 2 tall, thin figures. Ever since I gained this ability, people in the village started saying that I had narrowly escaped death and that the monk was my benefactor. My parents even spent $2,000 to create a memorial for the monk, which they worshipped daily at home. Things were going well until my aunt returned home and noticed the thick gold necklace my mother was wearing. "Why are you wearing a dog chain around your neck?" she asked. My mother rolled her eyes and said, "It's not a dog chain, it's a gold necklace. Your brother even bought one for you." My aunt examined the necklace carefully and asked, "Did my brother win the lottery or something? How did he get so rich?" My mother, laughing, explained that I could see and communicate with spirits. Recently, the late Mr. Thompson from next door appeared in my dream, telling me where his gold bars were hidden. Sure enough, Mr. Thompson's grandson dug them up from the exact spot I described, but my aunt wasn't interested in the details and stared at me intently. After a long silence, she suddenly said something that made my mother break out in a cold sweat. "Your son isn't just seeing things, his soul is partially trapped in the underworld." My mother quickly grabbed me, examining me from head to toe, and said, "That's ridiculous. How could his soul be trapped and still be alive?" My aunt explained that every person has 3 souls and 7 spirits, and that one of my souls and 4 of my spirits had been drawn to the underworld, which is why I could see the dead. My mother, desperate, asked if there was anything we could do. My aunt instructed her to gather some of my clothes, soil from a grave, a rooster, 6 bowls of rice, and a venomous snake. By the time they had gathered everything, it was nearly dusk. My aunt set up everything on an altar and lit 2 white candles at the head of my bed, placing a fire bowl at the foot. She instructed my mother to swing my clothes over the flames while striking the ground with a knife and chanting my name. As my mother did this, my father held me down, and my aunt closed the door, leaving only a crack open in one window. She then began drawing circles on my forehead with the grave soil and blew the soil onto my face. The moment the soil touched me, I started convulsing violently, my expression twisted in agony. My father, shocked, nearly let go, but my aunt yelled, "Don't let go, or it will all be for nothing." As the ritual continued, the room grew colder, and suddenly a gust of wind blew in through the window. My aunt checked the rice bowls and saw that 1/3 of the rice was gone, even though no one had touched it. She explained that the rice had been eaten by passing spirits, which was a good sign. They repeated the ritual several times until only a few grains of rice were left. Finally, my aunt picked up the remaining grains and stared at them intently before gasping and turning to my mother with a grave expression. "Tina, your son's soul can't return home. Something is blocking him." My mother, on the verge of panic, shouted towards the door, "Come back, Timothy, come back." But there was no response. My aunt then asked for the snake, but my father hadn't brought one, fearing its venom. My aunt, frustrated, explained that the snake was needed to guide my soul back. With no time to fetch one, she cut her palm and drew a symbol on my forehead with her blood, then began chanting rapidly. As the wind outside intensified, we suddenly heard a strange noise, like something crawling towards the door. My father peered out the window and gasped, "Snakes! The yard is full of them." Just then, a large white snake forced its way through the window. It was enormous, as thick as a grown man's arm, and it slithered towards my father, who instinctively grabbed a chair to strike it. My aunt shouted, "Don't hit it," and continued chanting. As the first snake entered, more followed, slithering into the room and even hanging from the curtains. Despite her fear, my mother shielded me with her body. Once all the snakes were inside, my aunt twisted the neck of the rooster, letting its blood drip onto the floor. The snakes grew more agitated, raising their heads and hissing towards the blood. My aunt chanted more incomprehensible words, and the snakes began devouring the rice on the floor. Only the white snake refrained, watching with unblinking eyes. After the rice and blood were gone, the snakes slowly left the room. Minutes later, the large white snake returned and coiled itself on my chest. My aunt yelled a final command, and my body convulsed before I suddenly sat up, only to collapse back down again. The snake silently slithered away, and my aunt breathed a sigh of relief. She instructed my parents to bury the headless rooster properly and to grind the remaining rice grains into a paste to apply to my forehead. She assured them that everything would be fine after that night. That night, I had another strange dream, where I found myself in a desolate world. But this time, I was surrounded by people in tattered clothes, squatting around me and eating. Two shadowy figures in the distance waved for me to follow them. As I started towards them, a beautiful woman appeared, blocking my path. "Silly boy, if you follow them, you'll never come back. This place doesn't belong to you. Come with me," she said, gently taking my hand. Her touch was cold but comforting. A mist surrounded me, and the next thing I knew, it was morning. When I awoke, my mother was by my bedside. Seeing that I was okay, she and my father burst into tears of relief. My father mumbled to himself, "The lady in the white dress. Could it be that white snake?" Later that day, my father took us to a shrine to make offerings to the white snake that had saved me. My aunt didn't come with us. After helping me, she left to visit a friend. My father didn't know exactly where the white snake was, so we went to a secluded spot in the woods, burning paper money and offering several chickens. We waited for hours, but the snake never appeared, so we went home. That night, I was woken by my mother, who frantically told me that my aunt had been in a car accident and we needed to go to the hospital. As I rushed to get dressed, I heard my father approaching on his motorcycle. Just as he was about to reach me, I felt a powerful force hit my neck, sending me flying backward. In that brief moment, I saw my father's face twist and morph into the monk's face. When I told my parents what had happened, they turned pale. My father immediately called my aunt, who returned half an hour later. She listened to my story in silence, then asked my parents, "Is there something you're not telling me? Why won't that monk let Timothy go?" My parents exchanged worried glances, but insisted there was nothing to hide. My aunt then asked my mother if she had encountered anything strange during her pregnancy. After a long pause, my mother hesitantly shared a memory. One day, while working in the fields, my mother noticed a woman lying injured on the ground, as if she had been attacked by a wild animal. Feeling sorry for her, my mother brought her home. As she carried the woman, she felt an unnatural coldness emanating from her. Just as they reached the house, a massive bolt of purple lightning struck nearby, destroying trees and rocks, but leaving our house untouched. After the 8th strike, the sky cleared, but when my mother stepped outside, another bolt struck her directly, causing her to faint. The doctors said it was a miracle she survived, and even more miraculous that the baby wasn't harmed. But when she woke up, the woman was gone, along with a gold hairpin that my grandmother had passed down. My father mentioned that they had found a snake skin in the bedding shortly after, along with 2 red snakes, which he had killed. My aunt's expression turned to horror. "You killed those snakes?